Thank you for joining me as we discuss the life of Granville Stanley Hall, also known as G. Stanley Hall. Through his contributions, Hall helped shape the field of psychology in many ways. In 1889, he was named the first president of Clark University, a post he filled until 1920. This is a photo from that time. Clark was born February 1st, 1844, in Ashfield, Massachusetts. He passed away April 24th, 1924, in Worcester, Massachusetts. He was raised on a farm by his father, who was a politician, and his mother, who was a teacher. Being raised by a teacher likely instilled in him a love for learning and curiosity about the human mind. According to Woody and Viney, this background laid the groundwork for his later achievements in the psychological field. Hall's education began in the rural schools of Massachusetts before he attended Williston Academy. At the age of 23, he graduated from Williams College, a significant milestone that marked the beginning of his academic pursuits. He then enrolled at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, where he initially explored a path in theology. However, his interests soon shifted to philosophy and then on to psychology. In 1869, he graduated with a PhD in psychology at the age of 34. He was the first American to do so. This accomplishment was the beginning of his influence on the field. He went on to become a founding member of the American Psychological Association and served as the first president, a position to which he was elected twice. Hall's psychological theories were likely influenced by his upbringing, particularly his exposure to religion through his devoutly religious mother. She encouraged him to become a pastor. He attempted to follow this path, but he was more interested in philosophy. Regardless, early exposure shaped his views on moral development and the role of religion in psychological growth. Brooks, Gunn, and Johnson discussed how Hall also wrote about differences between his experience growing up on a farm in rural Massachusetts and that of young boys who were raised in more urban environments. He understood the importance that developmental context can have on growth trajectories and the negative implications that growing up in suboptimal conditions can have. He believed that poor social conditions contribute to the involvement of young people in illegal activities and called for the eradication of these conditions. One of Hall's major contributions to psychology was his focus on the psychology of childhood and lifespan development. He was the originator of the biologically based theory on psychological development called a biogenetic psychology of adolescence. Hall adopted a developmental evolutionary approach which emphasized the importance of studying human growth from both a biological and evolutionary perspective. Hall was a strong advocate for establishing institutions dedicated to the study of children, a vision that has had lasting implications for both developmental psychology as well as education. Hall's theories continue to influence modern mental health practices. His ideas on delinquent behavior, sensation seeking, and the impact of peer and media influences remain relevant today, perhaps even more so due to the development of cell phones and social media. He was also ahead of his time in recognizing the importance of participatory learning and the educational needs of children. Hall's view that sexuality and sexual desire are quote-unquote normal and healthy was revolutionary for his time and aligns with many contemporary perspectives in psychology. Hall strongly influenced the use of questionnaires in research, a point which will be discussed further in this presentation. He opened the first research lab in the United States, an influence that has had long-lasting implications as research labs are commonplace today. He also began the first journal of experimental psychology in America. While that particular journal is no longer in print, it contributed to the development of other research publications. Many consider Hall the founder of adolescent psychology. He was the driving force behind the child study movement and worked with local teachers when he was at Clark University. As part of his research, he sent out thousands of questionnaires in 2 years. The scope of this work was extensive, and the method was subsequently used by others. There are also many elementary schools today that bear his name because of his focus on children. Hall wrote a number of books regarding adolescence, most notably Adolescence Volume 1 and Volume 2. As Arnett states, a surprising number of similarities exist between Hall's views of adolescence and today's views. His view of, quote, storm and stress, unquote, is more complex than was originally credited, and Hall's views are consistent with current findings in research. Volume 1 and Volume 2 of Adolescence were over 1,000 pages combined. In 2006, Arnett wrote an article, G. Stanley Hall's Adolescence. This was a review of the two books written by Hall on that subject. Arnett pointed out that Hall found that during adolescence, depressed mood increased, crime rates peaked, sensation seeking reached a peak, and it is a time when adolescents are more susceptible to media influences. He also noted that during this time, peer relations had a stronger impact on behavior. These findings are all consistent with current research. Hall also found that contributors to depression included suspicion of being disliked by friends, having faults that cannot be overcome, and the perceived hopelessness of love. Modern studies find social relationships with friends and romantic partners to be a common source of depressed mood in adolescence. Hall also noted the prevalence of what is today termed relational aggression, which is a current focus of research in adolescent peer relationships. Relational aggression is gossiping, spreading rumors, and excluding others from the group. Physical aggression can also be present and is seen more in males, where relational aggression is more common with females. In regard to cultural worldviews, it is important to acknowledge that Hall's work was shaped by the cultural and societal influences of his era. His research was biased by Victorian values that influenced his views on sexuality and gender roles. Hall argued that non-whites were the children of the human race and that their education should be based on an understanding of their indigenous culture and their capabilities. Muczynski points out that this view obviously supported a perspective of non-white subservience. It is unfortunate that Hall's work exhibited sexism and racism, but he also exhibited some contradictions in this behavior. For example, he supervised women in doctoral programs during his time at Clark University. As Deal notes, however, this did not necessarily constitute a change of mind on Hall's part. Rather, the behavior can be interpreted as economically and politically motivated. Deal states that, quote, Hall was willing to alter his educational policy on women to meet the exigencies of public opinion and financial need, end quote. He also did not consider these women to be representative of most women, as they likely would not produce children since they were pursuing an academic path. As Woody and Viney point out, Hall's actual views, quote, remain frustratingly obscure. For example, he published papers challenging racist assumptions and hired 3 Jewish scholars to join the faculty at Clark University, and he encouraged Black students to pursue graduate studies. However, he wrote these papers challenging racist assumptions anonymously while publicly supporting racism. The advocacy of controversial child-rearing practices is also problematic. Hall encouraged parents to, quote, toughen, unquote, their children by engaging in rough handling, the use of cold water baths, and other behaviors that would be deemed child abuse today. Throughout his career, Hall was a strong advocate for interdisciplinary cooperation, believing that psychology could benefit from the insights of other fields including legal, religious, medical, social, and instructional. Hall is credited with pioneering the use of questionnaires as a research tool. According to White, Hall set up the first cooperative normal science of child development. The findings that were obtained are largely consistent with today's view of child development. He dedicated his professional life to establish psychology's relevance to parenting and education. This led to welfare as a reform movement that was informed by research. As a result, increased value was placed on the healthy development of children and the use of research as a tool for identifying what children from all backgrounds need for optimal growth. Many components of Hall's theories led to his professional advocacy and the subsequent influence on my personal practice and career goals. I have worked with children and adolescents in my professional history. In these roles, questionnaires provided useful information regarding psychological challenges of both children and parents. The information also informed the use of specific therapeutic interventions as well as skill development practices. An interdisciplinary team was utilized to ensure that the families had all the resources needed to be physically and mentally healthy. The families with whom I worked were often of different races and ethnic backgrounds. I learned so many valuable lessons from my clients, including the fact that a one-size-fits-all approach would not be effective. Eunice points out that Hall saw people in categories from childlike people at the bottom to Westerners on top. The people he saw as childlike included people of other ethnicities. He suggested that Westerners' expectations of these people were too high. Eunice does point out that Hall was concerned about differences that separated races and ethnic groups, where his colleagues looked for common psychological processes that were applicable to all human behavior. Even though Hall exhibited racist views, in regard at least to considering cultural differences, Hall was ahead of his time. As I read about G. Stanley Hall's professional advocacy, I gained a greater appreciation of much of his work. G. Stanley Hall's contributions to psychology are both significant and complex. He played an important role in the development of the field of child and adolescent psychology and learning. His legacy is clouded by evidence of racial and gender bias and ethical concerns that were prevalent in his time. It is important to consider both the positive and negative aspects of his work. By doing this, a more comprehensive and human understanding of his legacy and its lasting influence on the mental health field can be seen. Thank you.